Welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Eun-Jung Cho. As tensions run high on the Korean Peninsula, the U.S. Secretary of Defense will visit Seoul soon. Threats posed by North Korea and China and trilateral cooperation among the U.S., Japan, and South Korea will top the agenda. Today, we discuss South Korea's security strategy.
This upcoming trip is a reaffirmation of our deep commitment to working in concert with allies and partners to chart our shared vision to preserve a free and open Indo-Pacific.
President Biden really was very, again, almost passionate in his commitment to supporting Japan and the
미국이 알아서 다 하는 이런 시스템에서 한국과 미국이 힘을 합치고
In the studio with me, Ambassador Mitchell Reiss, partner at the Brunswick Group, where he leads the firm's global geopolitical practice. Ambassador Reiss was the Director of Policy Planning at the State Department and the President's Special Envoy to the Northern Ireland peace process. Also joining us, Mr. Anthony Ruggiero, Senior Director at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Mr. Ruggiero was the National Security Council Senior Director for Counterproliferation and Biodefense during the Trump administration. He was also NSC Director for North Korea. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Now, Mr. Ruggiero, in 2017, North Korea said it has completed its nuclear weapon system, its state nuclear force. When North Korea says it already has nuclear weapons, can Washington continue to press Seoul to stay nuclear free? Koreans want nuclear parity.
Well, this is the bargain that South Korea has made. They've said they want to stay in the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, something that North Korea has violated and withdrawn from many years ago. I think it's important, as you noted, that North Korea is the one that has developed nuclear weapons. They're the ones that have threatened South Korea here. South Korea is a non-nuclear weapon state. I think they want it, for now, to stay that way. But it is a conversation we need to have, I think, in the post-Ukraine war environment.
Right. You say South Korea has already made that decision, but decisions can change.
Certainly, they can change. I think South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, other countries in the Middle East are looking at how the United States is responding to Russia, a nuclear weapons state, invading Ukraine, a non-nuclear weapons state. And Russia's nuclear threats are changing that dynamic. North Korea getting nuclear weapons and Russia invading Ukraine is really accelerating this conversation that I expect we'll have in terms of what does non-proliferation look like, nuclear non-proliferation look like after the Ukraine war.
Yeah, let's have more discussion about the viability of the extended deterrence during this discussion. Now, Ambassador Reiss, President Yoon Suk-yeol recently mentioned nuclear armament as policy option. He says if North Korea's provocation elevates, then South Korea can redeploy U.S. nuclear tactical weapons or possess its own weapons. And in response, the White House and the Defense Department emphasized denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula and improved extended deterrence capabilities. A week later, President Yoon dialed back his comments, and he said that our case realistic and rational option is to fully respect the NPT regime. I'm fully confident about the U.S. extended deterrence. Now, do you see a daylight between Washington and Seoul in terms of South Korea's potential nuclear armament? And why did President Yoon dial back his comment?
Well, first of all, let's remember that this isn't a new issue. In the past, South Korea has periodically raised the possibility of its acquiring nuclear weapons. In fact, they've actually gone a little bit further than that in trying to actually produce nuclear weapons during the 1970s. Subsequently, it has also risen from time to time whenever North Korea is provocative or South Korea doesn't have enough confidence in the U.S. nuclear umbrella. So I think that that's what's happening here, in part because of all the context which Anthony has just mentioned. It's top of mind, along with China's nuclear weapons expansion as well. So this is normal. It would be much better if these conversations were held in private, not in public. And I think that the United States needs to do a stronger job, I think both privately and publicly, in reassuring the president and the South Korean people that the U.S. security guarantee is credible and is consistent.
So President Yoon Suk-yeol, even though he dialed back his comment a week after, him publicly mentioning the nuclear option, does that somehow pile pressure on Washington?
Well, pressure in the sense that it's an indication that the president, perhaps many South Koreans, are feeling particularly insecure as North Korea accumulates nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles. So the United States is going to have to do a better job both communicating and, in fact, restoring confidence in the nuclear deterrent. And there are a variety of ways that that can happen. But let's remember, this is a bargain that South Korea and the United States entered into many, many years ago. It has worked. It has deterred North Korea from attacking South Korea again like it did in 1950. And with the right measure of reassurance, I think it can work for the foreseeable future.
If it was President Yoon's intention to pile pressure on Washington, he has succeeded.
Well, you could say that in the sense that it prompted a series of responses by U.S. officials. And I'm sure it did get the White House's attention, the State Department's attention. So in that sense, it probably worked. But in another sense, I think that it also highlighted some distance between the two allies. And I don't think, again, in public, that's a good thing to do. In private, of course, that's what friends and allies talk about. Publicly, I didn't think it was very helpful.
Mr. Ruggiero, President Yoon Suk-yeol visited UAE and said that Iran is UAE's enemy, just like how North Korea is South Korea's enemy. And then Iran government called in South Korean ambassador and complained, and also pointed out that President Yoon's recent comment about nuclear armament goes against the NPT regime. Is that for Iran to say?
Well, you know, it is kind of funny to hear Iran talk about compliance with the NPT when Iran is the one that is in violation of the NPT. That's not me saying, it's the International Atomic Energy Agency that has passed 2 censure resolutions because Iran is conducting undeclared nuclear activities that they won't talk to the IAEA about. So Iran perhaps maybe should come into compliance with the NPT before they start evaluating whether others should as well. I'll just say on President Yoon, you know, it seems like it's the second example where he's speaking very truthfully in public, things he probably says in private. I mean, he probably should have gone a step further, which is Iran is an enemy of South Korea. Iran works very closely with North Korea on its ballistic missile program, probably works, if not now, probably in the future on the nuclear side. That is a threat to South Korea. And so certainly South Korea should look at it in that direction, that Iran is a threat to them.
Now, Mr. Ruggiero, last year, North Korea tested ICBMs 8 times. If the U.S. were called upon to carry out its extended deterrence commitments, U.S. government officials may be constrained by the knowledge that North Korea can retaliate against a growing number of U.S. cities, which some say it doesn't by now. And would that somehow constrain the United States? And can South Koreans trust in the viability of U.S. extended deterrence?
Well, if I had to guess, this is probably why President Yoon made these comments about the about their own nuclear program and why he's now walked that back. My hope is that the two sides, along with Japan and perhaps other countries, are having frank conversations, because it's not just the North Korean nuclear program that the United States has to worry about. We're headed into an unprecedented time where we've never had, the United States has never had to deter 2 peer competitors. It's always been just Russia. Now it's going to be Russia and China, and now North Korea's nuclear program, and whatever happens with Iran's nuclear program. And I think South Korea and South Korea's new president is asking the simple question of, what happens if the United States, with its limited, by treaty, by the New START treaty, its limited deployed nuclear force and its limited missile defense, because we haven't been funding it, how does that all work together? Because it's not clear, looking at the nuclear posture review and the national defense strategy, that it has accounted yet for this new dynamic with the Ukraine war.
So you're saying South Koreans are asking a valid question, then what should be U.S. answer to that? To redeploy tactical nuclear weapons, or allow South Korea get its own nuclear weapons?
Well, I don't think we're at that point on either of those in terms of redeploying or allowing South Korea to get their own nuclear weapons. Again, they've made a treaty commitment not to do that, and they're better than North Korea in terms of violating their commitments. I think there needs to be a frank conversation. It's not clear to me that we're having that conversation yet, because I think we're all focused on the Ukraine war, which is understandable, but at some point we need to be thinking strategically about what's the right size of the U.S. nuclear arsenal, what's the right size of our missile defense, and how would we be able to address all of those issues simultaneously. That is something that we didn't have to deal with in the Cold War. So this is, I know a lot of people want to talk about a new Cold War. It's different this way, where we have on the nuclear side, things that may not even be relevant in terms of the previous scholarship in this area.
Ambassador Reiss, as North Korea's nuclear threat grows, does U.S. liability and cost to protect nuclear-free South Korea grows as well?
Well, I think it does for all the reasons that Anthony was just mentioning. There's a precedent here, which is during the Cold War, when the Soviet Union had more nuclear weapons than the United States, the question was, could they hold the United States ransom if they attacked Europe? And the calculation was, would the United States trade Boston for Berlin? Here, it's a question, will the United States trade San Francisco for Seoul? So it's not dissimilar. And the United States needs to do what it did during the Cold War, which is to provide the reassurance, not just verbally, but also in terms of weaponry, in terms of mil-mil and intelligence cooperation with South Korea, so it has confidence that the United States nuclear umbrella still extends above South Korea to adjust to the new reality of North Korea's nuclear weapons program and a growing Chinese nuclear force.
I think there needs to be a broader conversation about where we go on deterrence. I think for decades now, we've sort of kept ourselves in this box with U.S. and Russia, with a smaller Chinese nuclear program. I think, as Mitchell noted, if it's Seoul for San Francisco, but then also how does China react to our response to North Korea? That's another added element that was not there when we were talking about Europe's security with regard to just Russia. So I think this is a conversation that we need to start having now.
Ambassador Reiss, there's also concerns about the durability of U.S. extended deterrence provided to South Korea, just like how U.S. troops were once considered to be pulled out from South Korea. There are concerns that extended deterrence could also be withdrawn if an unconventional government in the United States takes office.
I think that's always been a concern. It's been a concern of the Europeans as well. And I think that given some of the rhetoric about America first that we heard in the previous Trump administration, that's not an unreasonable concern. However, I do think that it doesn't reflect what the majority of people on a bipartisan basis believe should be America's role in the world, in particular maintaining this alliance that has served both South Korea and the United States so well for so many decades. This again gets back to understanding how South Korea and our other allies can have confidence in American reliability. And part of it is rhetorical, but part of it is also demonstrated by our defense posture. And as Anthony was saying, it has to take account of new realities that are out there with new variables.
Mr. Ruggiero, Congressman Steve Chabot said to pressure China to use leverage on North Korea, we should explore at least talks with both South Korea and Japan about the countries having nuclear programs themselves, not necessarily to go down that nuclear path, but to get China's attention. Would this be an effective way to put pressure on China?
No. I think that's the simplest answer. I think it's kind of surprising that right now we would want to talk about violating the NPT, having conversations with South Korea and Japan, and in some instances potentially violating U.S. law that prohibits some of those kind of conversations, when what we could really do is just target Chinese banks, Chinese individuals, and Chinese companies that are assisting North Korea in its sanctions evasion. That's the simplest way to do it. President Obama did it in 2016 when he realized that his strategic patience policy was a disaster. President Trump did it in 2017 and early 2018. It works. We know it works. We know the Chinese don't retaliate because they're more worried about losing their access to the U.S. financial system. That's the direction to go.
But looking at China's hypersensitive reaction to the THAAD deployment in South Korea, China is obviously nervous about South Korea's armament.
They are, but I would just say on the THAAD deployment, they went after South Korea because they thought that they could bully South Korea, right? That's the reason they did it. They didn't come after the United States when we started picking off their Chinese banks one by one, right? And threatening that their larger Chinese banks were going to lose their access to the U.S. financial system. When we started doing that, they started to take notice, and they actually cut down trade. They started to look at some of these transactions. That's the direction to go. Violating an international treaty that we're trying to get Iran and other countries to, and Russia, frankly, to abide by, and making sure we abide by U.S. law, that's not the path to take. The path to take is the sanctions one.
Ambassador Reiss, Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin will visit Seoul soon. How do you think the President Yoon's recent nuclear armament comment will be dealt between Washington and Seoul officials, and what will be U.S. urgent security issue bringing to South Korea?
Well, I think it certainly got Secretary Austin's attention, as it did the entire administration. So I would expect that there would be some active discussions about which ways in which the United States could reassure South Korea of its commitment today and into the future, whether it's more troops, whether it's more training, whether it's different weapon systems in the mix, whether it's training exercises that come out to the peninsula and then go back. I think all these things are going to be on the table for the Secretary of Defense when he visits.
Now, Mr. Ruggiero, China is showing growing assertiveness against Taiwan. It is flying fighter jets to Taiwanese airspace, and Taiwan's foreign minister said this week that China is now more likely to invade Taiwan than before, and that could come in 2027. With the U.S. putting so much attention on Taiwan contingency, wouldn't the United States want its allies, South Korea and Japan, to take an active role in the case of Taiwan contingency?
Well, certainly. I think those are going to be part of the conversations. I would be surprised if the Secretary of Defense didn't raise these issues. I would also go back to the original conversation where we talk about North Korea. The thing I worry about when we talk a lot about Chinese invasion of Taiwan and how that looks or doesn't look like the Ukraine invasion, I'm also worried that North Korea will try and take advantage of that, right? And I would imagine South Korea and Japan probably have the same conversations about, well, they can't really move any of their troops or any U.S. troops or want to move any of that into the Taiwan theater because they're probably worried that the Kim regime, which whoever's in charge at that point, will actually be trying to go south or use their coercion, their nuclear assets, their missile assets to try and coerce South Korea and Japan into doing certain things that are against the United States. So again, that needs to be part of the conversation. This is not just a simple China-Taiwan conversation. It's how do we prevent a wider war in Asia at the same time.
Adding to what Mr. Ruggiero just said, Ambassador Reiss, there are calls in South Korea to limit South Korean involvement in the Taiwan contingency. In a survey in August, 42% of the South Korean respondents said South Korea should only provide rear area support. 65% says South Korea should provide direct or indirect support for U.S. military operations in a Taiwan contingency. Some experts in South Korea say that South Korea should be very clear in advance to America that it does not want to get involved in a Taiwan war and that its actions will be limited and that South Korea will only take rear and support role in the case of contingency. These voices coming out from Seoul, would that undermine the U.S.-South Korean alliance?
Well, first of all, let's hope not. Second, it's interesting to note that Japanese policy now has changed, in which they are saying publicly that they would be involved if China attacked Taiwan. So again, South Korea would have to take note of that. In rear area support, intelligence support, all the sorts of things that South Korean public is saying that they're willing to do means that they're going to be involved in the war. That is going to be a reality. That's part of what being an ally is. It means that you support your allied partner when they need support. I'd like to hope the United States would be sensitive enough not to ask South Korea to do more than its public is willing to do. At the same time, I think the South Korean leaders need to prepare the South Korean public that this is a contingency. I don't think that a Chinese invasion of Taiwan is going to happen this year, but there's certainly other measures that China can and probably will take to squeeze or pressure Taiwan. And that all has to be out there so the public understands what's at stake. And it's not just Taiwan, it's security and democracy in the region as well. So Taiwan is a proxy for the future of South Korea as well.
So Ambassador Reiss, you just said South Koreans should take note of Japan's actions. So would South Korea's passive role somehow give room for U.S.-Japan alliance to grow stronger? U.S.-Japan are already discussing specific countermeasures in the case of Taiwan contingency, including the possible Chinese use of nuclear weapons.
Well, I don't want to talk about what's being said at that level. I think that all of these contingencies are being discussed between the United States and Japan, as they should be. And I think that South Korea needs to think clearly about what its role should be and how far it thinks it could lead the South Korean people. But let's be very clear, if the Chinese do attack Taiwan, it's going to have serious implications for security in Northeast Asia and for South Korea and relations with North Korea.
Now, Mr. Ruggiero, South Koreans fear the level of Chinese retaliation will be more severe on South Korea as opposed to Japan. When we think about the gains and losses, well, would it be more beneficial for South Korea to get more actively involved in U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy or stay ambiguous, concerned about Chinese retaliation?
Well, yeah, that to me, you know, the conversation about what happens in a Chinese invasion against Taiwan and South Korea, the way they can address that now is to start to be more integrated into the Indo-Pacific strategy. I think, you know, South Korea, you mentioned the THAAD issue. There's some other reasons why they have not gotten as significantly involved in that. That's the way to really avoid both the potential evasion and then also those types of difficult choices down the road. I think South Korea has tried to be more neutral, and that has not worked out for them, to be frank. There are other countries in that region that have trended toward the United States on this issue, and I think they would be better off doing that now to potentially avoid those difficult decisions down the road.
Ambassador Reiss, for years, South Korea has been passive in calling out Chinese assertiveness, and it is not a member of Quad yet. So in the future, in the U.S.-led alliance networks in Asia, is there a chance that South Korea could be alienated in these minilaterals?
Well, I'd like to look at the other aspect of this, which is South Korea playing a larger role in Quad discussions and playing the role, I think, commensurate with its position as an American ally and one of the strongest economic performers in the world. To underscore what Anthony just said, the real future role for South Korea is to enhance deterrence. Nobody wants there to be any type of conflict in the region, whether it's Taiwan or North-South. And the more that South Korea can lean forward, the more that it can integrate, as Anthony said, with U.S. defense planning, I think that strengthens South Korea and it strengthens deterrence so that there will continue to be peace and stability in the region.
Now, Mr. Ruggiero, the Yoon government just recently announced its Indo-Pacific strategy, and compared to the previous government, which pursued a strategic ambiguity, do you think the Yoon government is pursuing strategic clarity and actually putting actions?
Well, that's what President Yoon has said, right? You know, almost a year ago, or May of last year, when he was inaugurated, you know, he talked about what Ambassador Reiss talked about, which is having South Korea play the role that is commensurate with their economic power in the world. And so, you know, when it comes to the Quad, this is not just an organization where you can just sort of put in your membership papers and that's it. I think the members of the Quad will want to see more and more actions when it comes to, you know, the conversation internationally with regard to China, when it comes to semiconductors. I mean, the list is quite long when it comes to China's bullying of Taiwan. These are all things that South Korea not only has to do things on the defense side, but has to be more vocal internationally about. And then eventually, I think, you know, they will likely become either a member of the Quad or some version of an expanded Quad, because they do have a role to play, but, you know, they haven't had a consistent China policy, unfortunately, as other countries have really started to shift their own policy.
Well, that's all the time we have for today. Ambassador Reiss, Mr. Ruggiero, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching. We'll be back here next week with U.S. experts to discuss the two Koreas and the region right here from Washington.